Tyrants are cowards. The reason they insist upon creating this massive security apparatus to surround themselves is because, of course, they understand the consequences of their malevolence and they fear the people as a result. In legitimate nations, governments create laws to protect the people from the government. In non-legitimate nations, governments create laws to protect the government from the people.
Hey friends, thanks so much for pushing play. Look, I think what you're about to hear is going to be one of the most gripping interviews, and why wouldn't it be? Because my guest is Jeff Nielson, one of the best truth tellers, certainly one of the most prolific economic pundits that we have on our side, and he's here to join me right now. Jeff Nielson from Bullion Bulls Canada. How are you, my friend?
Doing pretty good, but that's a pretty tough intro to live up to. I hope I won't disappoint your audience.
I know that you won't, because you've just written an article, Is Debt Jubilee Already a Done Deal? But before we get started, I just wanted to talk to you about the absolute devastation we're seeing across the global economic landscape. It hasn't necessarily manifested itself just yet in the Dow or the NASDAQ, as listeners know, Jeff, but the absolute devastation I mentioned here at the Open can really be exemplified by the GSCI. That was formerly known as the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, which, if people look at the chart, will see that the commodity supercycle, right, of the past 42 years has absolutely collapsed back to 1973. All gains from 1973 to 2016 have been erased. Take a look at this chart. If that's not a jaw dropper, I don't know what is, and I think it speaks to the global economic collapse, which we are now living through, Jeff.
Well, of course, once again, we see an arbitrary event, the takedown of commodity markets. And so once again, we look for an ulterior motive. And of course, commodities are our inputs in the production of everything. So if you attack commodity markets and ruthlessly suppress commodity prices, this is a very effective method of suppressing and hiding inflation. So, of course, hiding inflation and pretending it doesn't exist is one of the most important themes of this crime syndicate. It's their excuse for everything. There's no inflation, so we can keep interest rates permanently frozen near zero. There's no inflation, so we can keep this money printing going at extreme, insane levels forever. And so, this is another aspect of the inflation suppression conspiracy, attacking the commodity prices to destroy the input prices for the manufacturing process, and that's another means of stomping down on prices for finished goods.
You know, man, when you and I first started talking years ago, you didn't speak quite as freely using terms like crime syndicate, the one bank, the Rothschild cartel, but you hit the nail on the head now. Every single time, every single article. And so before we speak about your new article, Is Debt Jubilee Already a Done Deal? I just want to ask you this. What do you make of the fact that as we see this commodity supercycle come to an end and reset back to 1973 levels, what do you make of the fact that gold is holding up very well as all other quote-unquote commodities like copper collapse? Gold and silver are actually holding up, and I think it speaks to their value as real money.
Or we could simply step back a little further and look at the longer term gold and silver price chart and say, well, the banker simply took gold and silver down at the front end of this commodity suppression scheme, and now they're bringing the rest of the commodities down to match. So, this is the thing. It's so difficult to try to draw conclusions from short-term intervals in markets, especially when these markets are completely manipulated. Over longer terms, of course, the picture becomes clearer and we can make conclusions with a little bit more certainty. But, the current stabilization in gold and silver prices as other commodity prices are crashing could indicate a bunch of things. And it could simply be the fact that the bankers themselves have realized that they've taken these bullion prices as low as they can go without causing themselves severe additional harm.
Without causing themselves severe additional harm. That's an interesting statement, and I think it speaks to the fact that the banks have overextended nation states to the point where not even the Federal Reserve can print itself out of the black hole in which the United States government finds itself. I've always maintained that that was absolutely by design, and I think you'd agree with me. Bringing this nation to its knees is by design. Bringing this nation to its knees in terms of unrepayable debt, I have believed, is always part of the Rothschild playbook. And I think you'd agree with me. But as we take a look at the Federal Reserve now being the buyer of last resort for bonds, And as we see the nation states of Russia and China and other nation states turning against the dollar and against the Federal Reserve and against this Ponzi playbook, one might argue that the Fed has really backed itself into a corner. What's your take?
Well, and this is undoubtedly true. And it's the one big mystery we have in basically the last half century. Because, as I'm sure you know by now, this banking crime syndicate has been in charge of our economies and our governments basically for at least a century, and probably going back significantly further than that. But of course, if we look back to, for instance, the interval after World War II and through into the 1960s, it was relatively benign, benign system of overlords because we were allowed to experience some real prosperity. You know, the standard of living for the average person rose steadily during that period of time, and then all of a sudden, for whatever reason, this banking crime syndicate decided to become openly predatory and cannibalistic and turn upon their own power base and begin to cannibalize Western economies. And so the question becomes, you know, what caused this major change in philosophy sometime around the 1960s or possibly as late as 1970? Or is this, you know, simply been part of a longer term script where we were lulled to sleep during the good years between, you know, the 1945 and 1970, and then once we'd been lulled to sleep, they decided to get busy with their real raping and pillaging. But, you know, even then, you have to ask yourself, as you just did, what's the end game here? You know, they've backed themselves into a corner. If you cannibalize your own power base, what's the end game? And so, of course, this is why, you know, you've talked before and referred often to the material in the mainstream media predicting a general quote unquote reset. Was it 2018 was the year
Yeah,
that was?
the Economist magazine cover from 1988 projected a phoenix rising from the flames of burning fiat with a gold medallion around the phoenix's neck indicating 2018, and the cover said, "Get ready for a global currency."
Yeah, so this is the thing. You know, certainly at that time, they'd already formulated a long-term strategy, and they decided to cannibalize their own power base. The question becomes why, you know, and I've been able to ascribe no other motive than the fact that these people are simply psychopaths. You know, they're so unbalanced that their greed has overwhelmed their natural desire to protect their own power base because you know, you can't cannibalize your power base and use that power base to oppress the rest of the world at the same time. And so this is the corner that they've maneuvered themselves into. Their oppression internationally has never been more extreme, both in economic terms and militaristic terms, and yet the ability to sustain this oppression has never been weaker because of this cannibalism.
All right, well, staying on this track, I want to talk about your article here. Is Debt Jubilee already a done deal? And I want to just go down a couple paragraphs, read a piece, and then bump back up to the first paragraph and then turn it over to you. And you wrote, back when we had some degree of sanity and honesty in the reporting of the mainstream media, it was acknowledged that any debt to GDP measure above 100% represented a debt crisis. A nation whose entire economic output for one whole year could not retire all of its debts. All right, now back to the open. You write, Debt Jubilee is coming. That is to say, Debt Jubilee is coming for the Western world. This is not a prediction, and thus no crystal balls or other fancy forecasting techniques are needed. Rather, all that one requires is a rudimentary grasp of the current level of Western insolvency and the capacity to operate a calculator. So, Jeff, opening question. When you write about the Debt Jubilee, is it a debt jubilee for you, me, and our listeners, or is it just for the big banks?
And of course, that's the question. And so the hypothesis of the piece that you refer to is that debt jubilee is a done deal for everybody, meaning all of our governments, and that it's a secret deal. And the reasoning behind this is, first of all, if there has been a secret deal reached to wipe away everyone's debts, that would explain why governments in the rest of the world are still sitting back and allowing this rampant criminality to be perpetrated out of the Western bloc, because they would know that there's already an end date to this that's been agreed upon. Conversely, if debt jubilee is something that the bankers have just conspired upon privately, and it's intended to be only partial debt relief for the governments and the connected oligarchs, then of course we're left with the mystery of, well, why is the rest of the world simply sitting back and watching this? Would they really allow the West to essentially give itself a get out of jail free card and reset its own system while all the rest of the world's debts remain intact? That doesn't even seem to be plausible. And I referred in my article to just any community. If a bunch of your neighbors stood up suddenly and announced that they'd discovered a magic eraser which they'd used to erase all of their debts, and they were now quote unquote debt free, what would you do? Would you continue to pay interest on all your debts, or would you announce that you'd found a magic eraser too? So, this is the thing. The idea of a partial debt jubilee is so manifestly unfair that it seems impossible to believe that the rest of the world would sit back and watch it. So the alternative to that is that there's been a global agreement achieved in secret to detonate this debt jubilee at a specific time and date, and thus the rest of the world is simply sitting back and gritting their teeth and bearing things until that date comes around.
Yeah, and you've actually quantified for us these nations' overall debt to GDP ratios, and it's kind of stunning. And you note that the U.S. is at 233% overall debt to GDP. The worst of the bunch is Ireland at 390%. Greece, we know what the IMF did to the people of Greece through austerity, stealing their islands, their infrastructure, their waterworks. Greece is at 317%. Close behind it is Spain at 313%. Who would have realized that Portugal was at 358%, Belgium at 327%, our quote-unquote friends over in the UK, 252%, and you write that the poster boy for fiscal responsibility, end quote, is Germany at 188%. It's just an insane, laughable level of debt which will never, ever be repaid. And that's your thesis. At this point, the governments have been given a green light to just print in perpetuity because everybody knows, including the big bankers, that this debt will never be repaid.
Well, and this is the whole point. The least indebted nation in the West is already hopelessly insolvent. So, this is the point. You start at hopeless insolvency and then just go to more ridiculous levels of indebtedness beyond that. And just a couple of quick comments regarding a couple of the numbers. When you mention Greece with a debt to GDP ratio of 317%, our audience needs to remember that Greece already went through one default. It already erased 75% of its national debt once. And then after that, there's already been so much more additional debt piled on through, the fraudulent interest payments on the debt and the damage caused by austerity that it's already back up to 317% again. So, this is both a comment on the level of insolvency of these nations and how devastating is this masochistic quote unquote austerity. It's austerity is one of the tools by which the bankers are cannibalizing these economies even more rapidly. The idea is you cut off all money being spent on the people and take every penny of that and turn it into interest payments to the bankers. But of course, the problem there, as I explained I think it was a different commentary actually, is that there's a principle of economics known as the marginal propensity to consume. And it's a universally accepted principle because it's nothing but common sense and simple arithmetic. And the gist of it is that if a government takes $1 of money and it decides, where it's going to place that dollar, if it puts the dollar into the hands of a member of the poor or the middle class, that dollar is going to be spent almost entirely. And so it flows entirely into the economy. And then, of course, the people who receive that dollar spend part of the dollar on taxes or goods and services of their own or wages, and then it keeps being spent and respent. And that's called the multiplier effect. As a matter of simple arithmetic, any economy will be healthier if most of the money flows into the hands of the poor and the middle class. And so with austerity, we have a reverse multiplier effect. We have governments masochistically taking massive quantities of dollars out of the hands of the poor and the middle class, and then that multiplier effect gets reversed. There's less and less consumption, so less and less recirculation of funds. And of course, where are these dollars going? Well, they're going into the hordes of the ultra wealthy, people who never spend more than the tiniest fraction of what they receive. So this is what is causing our economies to die even more rapidly, is this hollowing out process, which is starving our economies of the capital needed to keep them alive.
Well, that actually leads me to this next question, which really gets me back to the previous question about debt jubilee. When we see an article that says, is debt jubilee already a done deal? Everybody gets a little bit excited because debt forgiveness for the people would be a great thing. I think they did it every 50 years in ancient Rome, but that I don't think is what we're going to get. And you write here in your article, quote, "This is the Western world, a club of mega debtors who are all so far in the hole that they could never ever grow and repay their way out of such indebtedness. Several previous commentaries have identified what this really signifies: debt slavery." And therein lies the paradox. The debt jubilee versus debt slavery. And I think what we the people are going to get here in the Western world is debt slavery. These bankers, these Rothschild satanic bankers, Jeff, want to do to us what they've done to the people of Greece.
And it's certainly a possibility. But here's the problem for the bankers themselves is uh, their own obsessive greed has blinded themselves to the economic realities here. There's a quasi principle in the world of economics known as the Pareto principle or even the Pareto equilibrium. And it's this pseudo intellectual nonsense that like what we often observe in the world, even in the natural animal populations, are we see these weird dichotomies where 20% of a population has control of 80% of the resources of a particular area. And so the because this 80-20 split has been observed in a number of areas, including in human societies, this philosopher scientist named Pareto, this Italian gentleman several hundred years ago, came up with this theory that this 80-20 split was somehow a natural phenomenon or even an equilibrium. And applying it to humanity, what we're talking about is wealth. The idea of 20% of the population holding 80% of the wealth and calling this, quote unquote, an equilibrium. And see, where this is totally flawed is in the idea that just because we can see something sustained at this unequal level does not mean it's an equilibrium. Rather, it means it's a threshold. One of the permanent realities of humanity is that the people on top always try to steal from those beneath them and steal as much as possible. And thus, when we see this 80-20 wealth split occurring in societies, and oftentimes throughout history, it doesn't indicate that this is some sort of optimal equilibrium. Rather, it's a ceiling. It's the most that the wealthy can steal from those below them without an economy imploding. And so this is why we don't see the wealth inequity getting more extreme than 2080, because when it does get more extreme, the society and economy quickly implodes. So of course, this is what we have in Greece right now. We have all of the wealth, virtually being sucked out of the hands of the bottom 80% or even 90% of the population and being hoarded by the wealthy. There's no capital circulating in the economy. So Greece's economy can never become functional again. If things continue as they are in Greece, Greece will become a failed state. It will continue to devolve. It will even lose industrialization because you cannot sustain an industrialized society with wealth inequity at such utterly incredible extremes. So I certainly think that the oligarchs are intending to take the model of Greece and apply it across the Western world. But doing that would be the most suicidal thing they could do because it would guarantee the complete implosion of all of our societies and, like I say, very possibly devolving below the level of industrialization. In other words, we could become like China and India were 40 or 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. And that is where we're heading if the oligarchs continue on their present course and if they are allowed to continue on their present course.
Well, and there's the point, there's the rub. Will they be allowed to be? Because the actions they're taking may finally wake up even the sleepiest of sheeple. And one of the things that you and I can definitely agree on, because where we may disagree is that I think that what you've just described is exactly what they want to do. If you look at Agenda 21, Agenda 2030 policies, UN Agenda 21 policies, they do want to rewind the clock to 14th century living standards in the United States. They want to restrict our access to energy. They want to reduce carbon emissions to zero. Without new forms of energy, we will live as serfs. I think that's exactly what they want. The question is, will they get away with it? And you write in your article here, you sum it up perfectly. We now live in corrupted societies with traitor governments, which year after year devote all of the profit, quote unquote, profit of our economies to paying interest on debts to a banking crime syndicate, which you've hyperlinked to, which I'm sure takes me to the one bank and the evil Rothschilds. And you write, and still we sink further and further into debt. It is an organized crime in one of its crudest forms, a systemic extortion racket. That sums it up. And I hope that finally the sleepiest of the sheeple wake the hell up, Jeff, because the truth is, and I've been saying it for a very long time, at this point in human history, it's the banksters versus humanity.
And they've essentially made it an overt declaration of war with the extreme level of this crime. But the question is, will enough people wake up to form a critical mass necessary to achieve any sort of action before the bankers have completed the complete disintegration of our economies and societies? And see, the thing is, the catch-22 in what they want to do, and as I was saying before, taken to the extreme level of poverty and oppression of Greece, we can't even sustain an industrial society. But the thing is, the bankers are now totally reliant upon a high-tech society as their system of oppression. So their big brother surveillance system cannot survive if we deindustrialize. You can't have a high-tech kernel in an agrarian economy. There's not enough infrastructure to sustain it. There's not enough technical support to keep it operating, or programmers to continue to innovate and keep up with evolving technology. So what we would see here is what we've seen often in the past with empires in history. An empire becomes obsolete. It becomes so corrupted and internally cannibalistic that it essentially makes itself irrelevant, because history passes it by. And other nations and other growing empires or growing regional powers simply pass it by because they have more legitimate systems. And so their systems actually progress in advance, whereas you have this stunted little corrupt block of insane, greedy oligarchs that are continually, cannibalizing and reducing their own power base. So there's no possibility that they could ever keep up with the rest of the world if they pursue this model.
Well, I think the listeners and the readers of your work and I are all on the same page. What we all agree upon is the fact that these people at the top of the Illuminati New World Order pyramid are absolute maniacal monsters. They're criminally insane, and they do not care about human beings. They only care about their greed, their avarice, and probably Satan himself. And your article was titled, "Is Debt Jubilee Already a Done Deal?" Question, right? You've asked a question. And you conclude your article, and this is a must-read. Debt Jubilee is coming. Logic tells us it could or should be for everyone. Logic also tells us it would have to be the world's most closely guarded secret. One final warning. If Debt Jubilee is not a done deal on a global basis, but rather a privilege which the Western crime syndicate plans on attempting to reserve for itself, then in such a world, Debt Jubilee would likely not be for everyone, even within our own corrupted bloc. Rather, what we would almost certainly see is more of the same. For the fat cats and our criminal governments, it would be the carrot, all their debts wiped clean. For the little people, it would just be more of the stick. Their debts remain. Their debt slavery never ends. You've summed it up here perfectly. It'll be Debt Jubilee for the banks, not for you and I, not for the people of the United States, not for the people of the West.
Well, of course, I issued this warning to people to make sure that readers didn't reach the conclusion, oh, well, Debt Jubilee is coming, so that means I can go on a borrowing spree. I don't want people to endanger themselves in that manner on something that cannot be relied upon. But at the same time, ultimately, the economic cannibalism we're seeing must come to an end, because, like as I was saying with this Pareto threshold, the bankers will essentially destroy the capacity to rule the society, because we won't. I mean, extended to the ultimate extreme, it's road warrior. we just become a totally destroyed, post-industrialized, apocalyptic society with no government at all.
Right.
And so that's what would ultimately happen if they were allowed to keep on going and keep on going. And of course, that level of disintegration, seems impossible. But the final wild card, of course, and it gets back to our labeling of these people as psychopaths, in order to prevent the rest of the world from simply taking the reins of economic power away from them. Of course, we have this very real possibility of some massive war being staged as a means of hanging on to power and instituting even more extreme oppression.
Well, you mentioned Road Warrior, and that scenario is certainly not lost on the prepping community and the people that are awake and understand what the bankers are up to and understand what the bankers have done to Greece. I think if you live in Greece and you've lost your job and you're one of the 30% or more of the people of Greece who are unemployed and you can't feed your family, then that allegory of the Road Warrior is how you see life. Even though the sun comes up every day and the sky is blue and you live in a beautiful place on earth, if you can't feed your family and you can't feed yourself and you're desperate, then you very much do live in the paradigm of the Road Warrior. My fear, Jeff, is that these maniacal bankers are so insane that they want to force us potentially into a third world war, a nuclear exchange with Russia and or China. And then we'll be left with the Cormac McCarthy novel, the 2006 novel by American writer Cormac McCarthy, called The Road, which is the Road Warrior on steroids. It's a desperate situation where you cannot even find food to feed your family, and most of the population has been wiped out. I pray they don't take us there, Jeff. These people need to be stopped before they do take us there.
And here's where I spend a lot of time arguing against myself internally, both with the scenario you presented and then with the alternative to that, which is basically we can never forget that though these people are psychopaths, they're also cowards. These are people who never, ever step out of the shadows and try to do things openly and publicly because they're afraid of the repercussions. Mm-hmm. They hide in the shadows. They manipulate people from behind the scenes. And of course, they never, ever put themselves in a position where they could be subject to potential harm. And so this is what I consider to be our only salvation, is the cowardice of the psychopaths and the fact that they themselves realize that if they unleash the nuclear genie out of the bottle, that they may never be able to put it back in, and the result may be just a steaming, lifeless, glowing globe floating in the universe.
Yeah, well, you sparked a thought, and let's end on this. It reminds me of JFK in the convertible with Jacqueline before the powers that be, the deep state, the Bush banking cartel, executed President John F. Kennedy. The president was approachable and was a man of the people and spoke from a place of common sense. I'd even tell you that when I went and saw Ron Paul speak twice when he was running for president, it was the exact same type of scenario. No Secret Service, not surrounded by armed men, not in a bulletproof enclosed limousine. You could walk up and shake his hand. He spoke with common sense that gave you goosebumps and brought you to tears.
Dr. Paul, thank you for all you're doing from all of us. We appreciate what you're doing, sir.
And what we see contrasted against that by the New World Order demonic powers that are in control of our government is Obama reading from a teleprompter, every speech written, always closely guarded by a security detail. Same with Hillary Clinton. Same with all of these oligarchs, right? Their model is one of Big Brother. They must be protected at all costs because they do not speak from a place of truth and honor. They speak from a place of despotism. They speak from a place of tyranny. They speak from a place of satanic rule. They don't speak from a place of love and common sense. They don't speak for the people. They speak for the oligarchy. So to that degree, I completely agree with you. They must fear for their lives because they speak truly from a place of evil.
Tyrants are cowards. The reason they insist upon creating this massive security apparatus to surround themselves is because, of course, they understand the consequences of their malevolence and they fear the people as a result. And, of course, this is the big distinction between a legitimate nation and a non-legitimate nation. In legitimate nations, governments create laws to protect the people from the government. In non-legitimate nations, nation's government, create laws to protect the government from the people.
Well, Jeff, it's just such a thrill to have known you for so long. I'm so glad you're still out there writing articles, multiple articles a day. In fact, probably one of the most prolific economic writers out there, writing about precious metals and the real economy, global economy. Why don't you remind people how they can read your work? I know that you post for Sprott Money, but tell them about your own personal website as well, please.
Sure. I started off with my own website, bullionbullscanada.com, and I published over 1,100 commentaries there over the past 700 or 7 years, rather. And of course, we also have a very active forum. It's a free site, so people are welcome to come by, sign up, and join our community.
Well, Jeff, I want to thank you so much for your time. I think this was a very important article for posterity's sake, meaning that years from now, people will be able to understand what happened. What could have happened was a debt jubilee for the people. And probably, as they reread your article years later, they're going to realize that it wasn't a debt jubilee for the people. It was a debt jubilee for the oligarchs. I hope that doesn't happen, and I hope the little people, the sleepiest of the sheeple, finally wake up and point their fingers at the true enemies of humanity, the fat cats, the Rothschilds, the criminal cartel, which you have named in this article. Our guest has been Jeff Nielson, a tremendously talented writer, an honest pundit and truth teller. His website is bullionbullscanada.com. You can also see his commentaries and articles posted at sgtreport.com. And Jeff, thanks again so much for your time.
Always a pleasure to be here, Sean.
Always a pleasure to have you, my friend. And guys, always a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for pushing play. And thank you. If you want to support us, hit the like button. Leave us a kind comment or feedback that's proactive. We really, truly appreciate your support. Spread this information. Share this video on Facebook. Tweet it out. Send it to your friends and neighbors and colleagues in email form. It's important for people to finally wake up. It's the only way that we have a chance to take these oligarchs on, because they have all the money and they have the funny money printing press, but we have truth on our side. And even in the darkest room, a candle can dissipate the darkness. God bless you. Thanks for supporting us at sgtreport.com and thelibertymill.com. Real news 24/7. Thanks for listening. Have a great week.